The ocean is a graveyard of forgotten stories, a resting place for ships that never made it home, and ports that once thrived but now rot beneath the weight of time. What secrets do they hold? What horrors lurk in the depths, waiting to be uncovered? Tonight, we take you deep into the heart of the unknown, where history and nightmares collide. A team of explorers embarks on a journey to document lost wrecks and forsaken harbors. But what they find is far more terrifying than they ever imagined. Reality twists. The past refuses to stay buried, and something watches from the shadows. Do you believe the dead can haunt the sea? What would you do if you found yourself trapped in a place where time no longer moves, where voices whisper from the water, and where every step takes you closer to something you were never meant to find? Tell us in the comments. And if you're ready to dive into the unknown, like, subscribe, and share, because what you're about to hear will make you question if some places should remain untouched forever. Now, let's begin. The sky was bruised with streaks of violet and crimson as the expedition team arrived at the decayed remnants of Blackwater Port. Once a thriving hub for trade and travel, it now stood in eerie silence. The scent of salt and rotting wood thickened the air. The only sounds were the distant cries of gulls and the rhythmic lapping of waves against the skeletal remains of long-abandoned ships. Ethan Graves, the team leader, adjusted the strap of his backpack and glanced at his crew. There were 5 of them in total: Rebecca, the historian; Cole, the deep-sea diver; Luis, the cameraman; and Alice, the skeptical journalist who had agreed to document their findings. Each of them carried a mix of excitement and unease, drawn to the mystery of Blackwater Port, but wary of the stories surrounding it. "All right," Ethan said, his voice steady. "We all know why we're here. The legend says Blackwater was abandoned overnight, ships left to rot, buildings untouched, as if the entire population vanished without a trace. Our job is to find out why." Rebecca adjusted her glasses and consulted her notes. The last recorded activity here was in 1897. After that, nothing. Ships that tried to dock either disappeared or came back empty. Luis chuckled nervously. "And yet, here we are." "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Alice said, already recording on her phone. "We're here for history, not ghost stories." But as they stepped onto the worn wooden planks of the dock, the feeling of being watched settled over them like a thick fog. The town beyond was a corpse of its former self. Houses with shattered windows, rusting street lamps that hadn't glowed in over a century, and signs barely hanging onto their frames. The tavern, the general store, the harbor master's office, all standing, but lifeless. "Look at this," Rebecca murmured, pointing at a table outside a cafe. A set of plates sat there, as if someone had abandoned their meal mid-bite. The food had long since rotted away, but the cutlery remained perfectly placed. Cole shivered. "It's like everyone just left." They moved deeper into the port, documenting everything. Luis's camera caught the crumbling facades, the cobblestone streets choked with weeds, and the strange way the town seemed frozen in time. Then the first sign of something wrong. "Do you hear that?" Ethan asked. A faint creaking sound, like footsteps on rotting wood. They turned in unison, but there was nothing, just the empty street stretching before them. "I don't like this," Alice muttered. Ignoring the unease curling in their stomachs, they pressed on. Ethan led them toward the docks where the largest wreck, the Iron Widow, lay half submerged in the murky waters. It had been the pride of Blackwater, a merchant ship that disappeared the same night the town was abandoned. Now its rusted frame jutted from the water like broken bones, its hull blackened with time. Cole adjusted his wetsuit. "I'll go in first," he said, preparing to dive. "Be careful," Rebecca warned. The water swallowed him whole, the ripples distorting his descent. The radio crackled as he checked in, his voice steady but cautious. "There's something off down here. The ship's covered in barnacles, but there are strange markings on the hull, like symbols." "What kind of symbols?" Ethan asked. Cole didn't respond. A long, crackling silence filled the air. "Cole?" Static. Then, a scream. Not from the radio, from the town. Alice turned, her face pale. "We're not alone." Something moved in the shadows of Blackwater Port. The scream echoed through the empty streets of Blackwater Port, rattling through the bones of abandoned buildings and shaking the fragile silence. It was not Cole's voice. This was something else, something that did not belong to them. Ethan's blood turned ice cold as he grabbed the radio. "Cole, are you there?" The static hissed like a breathing thing. Then came a faint whisper. Not Cole's voice, not any of theirs, just a fragmented murmur that sent shivers down their spines. "Turn back." The connection cut. "Hell no," Lewis whispered, gripping his camera. His hands were shaking. That was not Cole. Alice was already backing away from the docks, scanning the shadows between the buildings. The sinking sun cast long, unnatural shapes that seemed to stretch and twitch when no one was looking directly at them. "We need to find him now," she said. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Rebecca, stay here and try to reestablish radio contact. Luis, Alice, come with me. We're going after Cole." The three of them hurried toward the edge of the docks. The water was still, eerily calm despite the chaos unraveling around them. Cole's oxygen tank bobbed on the surface, but there was no sign of him. Then Luis caught something on his camera's screen. "Wait, what is that?" He zoomed in, focusing on the hull of the Iron Widow. There, just beneath the murky waterline, were the strange symbols Cole had mentioned. They weren't just scratches or erosion marks. They were carved into the ship's metal, deep and deliberate, circular patterns intertwined with jagged lines, like something ancient and unreadable. But that wasn't the worst part. The symbols were glowing. A faint, sickly green light pulsed from the etchings, flickering like a heartbeat. Then something broke the surface. A hand, pale, waterlogged, fingers curled unnaturally. Alice screamed as the hand clawed at the air before vanishing beneath the water. It was followed by another, and another. More hands rising from the depths, reaching toward the dock. Their movements were sluggish, unnatural, as if they were suspended in time. Ethan grabbed Alice's wrist and yanked her back. "Run!" They bolted from the docks, their breaths ragged, their footsteps thundering against the wooden planks. Behind them, the water churned violently, sloshing against the wrecked hull of the Iron Widow. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into an indecipherable chorus of voices. They didn't stop running until they reached Rebecca. She was furiously twisting the radio dial, trying to cut through the static. "Any luck?" Ethan asked, struggling to catch his breath. Rebecca shook her head. "Nothing. But I did hear something. A voice. A woman's voice." Alice wiped sweat from her forehead. "What did she say?" Rebecca hesitated before answering. Then, in a low, haunted whisper, she repeated the words. "You should not have come." A heavy silence fell over the group. "We need to get out of here," Luis said, his voice cracking. "This place is cursed. We shouldn't." A wet thud cut him off. They all turned toward the docks. Cole lay there, sprawled on the planks like a broken puppet. His wetsuit was torn, his body slick with seawater. His eyes were open, wide, unblinking. But something was wrong. His mouth moved, lips forming words, but no sound came out. Ethan knelt beside him. "Cole, what happened? Are you hurt?" Cole's chest heaved as if it took great effort to breathe. Then at last, sound returned to him. A whisper, so faint they had to lean in to hear it. And when they did, their stomachs dropped. "We are not alone." Cole's words hung in the thick, salty air, freezing Ethan and the others in place. "We are not alone." Luis's grip on his camera tightened. Who else is here?" Cole's eyes darted frantically toward the Iron Widow, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His fingers twitched against the soaked wood, as if trying to grab something that wasn't there. Ethan placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Cole, focus. What happened down there?" Cole swallowed hard, his skin pallid and clammy. I saw them." His voice was raw, barely more than a whisper. "They were waiting." Alice stiffened. "Who?" Cole's lips trembled as he forced out the words. "The crew." A deep, suffocating silence followed. Rebecca was the first to break it. "The crew of the Iron Widow? Cole, that's impossible. They've been dead for over a century." Cole squeezed his eyes shut. "That's what I thought too. But they..." He let out a shuddering breath. They aren't dead. Not really. Luis backed up, shaking his head. No, no, this is insane. You almost drowned. You probably... I didn't imagine it, Cole snapped, suddenly finding his voice. His hands clenched into fists as he forced himself into a sitting position. I was inside the wreck. The ship is... wrong. The walls shift. The doors lead to nowhere. And then I saw them. Faces in the dark. They were moving, but their eyes weren't. Alice's stomach twisted. What does that even mean? Cole shuddered. It was like they were stuck, frozen in time, but their bodies kept moving, twitching, drifting. Their mouths... He stopped, his face contorting with fear. They were trying to scream, but no sound came out, rattling the skeletal remains of ships and slamming a rusted sign against a crumbling wall. Ethan exhaled, trying to steady himself. We need to go. Cole looked up at him, his expression grim. We can't. Rebecca frowned. Why not? Cole's voice was barely audible. They won't let us. At that moment, Luis's camera beeped, a low, static-laced noise that sent a cold shiver down his spine. He looked down at the screen, confused. That's weird. My battery was full a minute ago. Then the screen flickered. The image of the Iron Widow came into focus. But something was wrong. There were figures standing on the deck. Luis's breath hitched. Guys, we have a problem. The others crowded around as he replayed the footage. It was grainy, but there, clear as day, were silhouettes on the ship. Dozens of them, motionless, watching. Alice whispered, "Oh my God." Then the figures moved. Not with normal motion, they twitched. Like marionettes with broken strings, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they turned toward the camera. Their mouths hung open, hollow, dark. The screen cut to black. A shrill, ear-splitting sound erupted from the camera, a noise so unnatural, so filled with agony, that Luis dropped it. The device hit the ground and sparked, the lens cracking. Then in the silence that followed, footsteps, slow, dragging, coming from inside the town. Ethan's heart pounded. He turned toward the empty streets, his breath hitching as a shadow moved between the buildings. A figure, not one of them. Rebecca let out a sharp gasp. No, that's not possible. The figure stepped into the light. It was a man, dressed in tattered, salt-stained clothing. His skin was gray, bloated. His eyes were vacant pits, black and unblinking. But the worst part, Rebecca recognized his face. Her voice was barely a whisper. That's Captain Elijah Harlow, the last captain of the Iron Widow. The figure jerked forward, and then the others came. Dozens of them, emerging from the alleyways, from behind buildings, from the shadows themselves. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. Run! They bolted. Through the empty streets, past crumbling buildings, their feet slamming against the cobblestone. The dead things behind them did not run. They simply moved, gliding forward in unnatural, jarring movements, their bodies flickering like a broken film reel. Rebecca choked out, Where do we go? Luis gasped, The boat! We have to get to the boat. But as they neared the docks, their blood ran cold. The boat was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. Luis let out a strangled cry. No, that's impossible. Ethan spun around. The figures were still coming, silent, unstoppable. Their empty eyes locked onto the living. Alice was panting, hands trembling. We're trapped. And then from the shadows, a voice. Software. Familiar. You should not have come. The air turned heavy, suffocating, and the whispers started again. The whispers slithered through the air, curling around them like invisible tendrils. Ethan felt them crawling into his skull, pressing against his thoughts, filling the spaces in between. Voices, many, layered, calling, pleading, warning. You should not have come. Rebecca clutched her ears. Make it stop. But the voices only grew louder. Alice grabbed Ethan's arm, her nails dug into his skin. We can't stay here. Ethan forced his legs to move, shoving past the paralyzing fear. He turned to Luis, who was still staring at the empty docks, his breath coming in rapid, shallow gasps. Their boat was gone. Their way out was gone. Cole groaned, struggling to his feet. "We have to find shelter." Luis's voice was barely a whisper. "There is no shelter." The figures were still coming. Slow, relentless, silent. Their bodies flickered under the dying light, moving in unnatural jolts and twitches. The black pits of their eyes were fixed on the group. And then one of them spoke. "You belong to the tide now." Ethan's blood turned to ice. The voice was not human. It was fractured, layered, as if many mouths spoke at once. Then they lurched forward. Alice screamed. Ethan grabbed her wrist and ran. The others followed, feet pounding against the cobblestones, lungs burning as they darted through the decaying streets of Blackwater Port. The town was a labyrinth of twisted alleyways, rotting storefronts, and skeletal remains of buildings long since abandoned. But the figures, they were everywhere. They stood in doorways peering through shattered windows. They loomed at street corners, their heads tilting in unnatural angles, watching as the group ran in blind terror. And then, Louis tripped. The world seemed to slow. His body slammed into the ground, his camera skidding across the street. Ethan turned just in time to see the figures closing in. Luis's breath hitched. "Help!" Ethan lunged forward, grabbing his arm and yanking him up just as cold. Dead fingers grazed his ankle. Luis let out a choked sob, scrambling back as one of the figures reached for him. A bloated, salt-stained corpse dressed in the tattered remains of an old sailor's uniform. Its jaw hung loose, unhinged, moving as if trying to speak, but only a wet, gurgling sound escaped. Then its mouth stretched wider, unnaturally wide, too wide. Ethan shoved Luis forward. "Go!" They ran, blindly, desperately. Their surroundings blurred into a mess of dark alleyways and ruined buildings, the air thick with the stench of seawater and decay. Then Rebecca gasped, pointing ahead. "There! That building!" It was the harbor master's office, one of the few buildings still partially intact. Its door hung open, swinging gently in the wind. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Cole, half dragging him as they stumbled inside. Alice and Rebecca followed, slamming the door shut behind them. Louis collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. Silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Alice turned toward the others, her face pale. "Did we lose them?" Ethan pressed his ear to the door. Outside, the street was empty. The figures were gone. For now. "We need to barricade this," Cole muttered. His voice was hoarse, shaken. "Whatever those things are, they're not real, not in the way we understand." Rebecca scanned the room. Dust-covered furniture, old ledgers scattered across the floor, rusted lanterns hanging from the ceiling. A large wooden desk sat against the wall. "That'll work," Ethan said, nodding toward it. "Help me push it." Together they shoved the desk against the door, the wood groaning under the weight. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would buy them time. Alice wiped sweat from her forehead. "Okay, now what?" Ethan turned, scanning the darkened room. His pulse was still racing, his thoughts tangled with fear. Louis grabbed his camera, shakily rewinding the footage. "I need to see what I recorded. I need to know if—" He stopped. Ethan frowned. "What?" Louis's hands trembled. He turned the screen toward them. The footage played. The figures on the deck of the Iron Widow, their faces empty, hollow. But then, a new face. Ethan felt his stomach drop. It was him. In the footage, Ethan stood on the ship's deck, staring blankly at the camera. But he had never been there. His eyes in the video were vacant. His lips moved, forming silent words. Then his head jerked unnaturally, twisting at an impossible angle. The screen cut to static. Ethan stumbled back. "No, that's not real. That didn't happen." Luis's voice was barely a whisper. "Then explain it." Silence. Then the whispers returned. "The tide calls to you." The voices were inside the room. Rebecca's breath hitched. "Where are they coming from?" Ethan followed the sound, his hands shaking. Then he saw it, the mirror. It stood in the corner of the room, covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. But beneath the filth, something moved. Their reflections, but they weren't right. Luis's reflection was still on the ground, even though he had already stood up. Rebecca's reflection had no face. Cole's reflection twitched. And Ethan's reflection? It was smiling. A slow, wide, unnatural grin. Then it spoke. You should not have come. The mirror shattered, and the door behind them burst open. The door exploded inward, shards of splintered wood flying across the harbor master's office. The force sent Ethan and the others sprawling to the ground. A deafening roar filled the room. Not human, not natural. Ethan scrambled backward, his hands slipping against the dust-covered floor. The figures stood in the doorway, motionless, their black, unblinking eyes absorbing the dim light. The wind outside howled through the broken town, but inside it was silent. Too silent. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the figures lurched forward. Move! Ethan shouted. Cole was the first to react, yanking Rebecca to her feet and diving behind the overturned desk. Luis grabbed Alice's hand, dragging her toward the back of the room. Ethan turned to follow. A cold hand clamped around his wrist. His body went rigid. The touch was like ice and rot, seeping into his skin. He turned his head slowly, heart hammering. One of the figures had him. The face was wrong. Skin stretched too tightly over a skull-like frame, its mouth hanging open in a silent scream. The lips cracked, split, but no blood came. Ethan struggled, but the grip tightened. Then the whispers changed. They were no longer distant, no longer a collective murmur. They were speaking to him. We see you. We know you. The figure tilted its head, its mouth moving, but the voice came from everywhere. You do not belong here, and yet you do. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, a deep, sickening pull, as if something inside him was responding. The room warped. The edges of his vision blurred. The harbor master's office melted away, replaced by something else. The ship, the Iron Widow. He stood on its deck, the fog thick and suffocating. The sky above was a swirling abyss, void of stars, void of anything alive. The ship creaked beneath him, groaning like something in pain. He turned, and they were there. The crew, not corpses, not spirits, something in between. Their faces were frozen, expressions locked in a moment of horror that never ended. Their bodies moved, twitching, jerking, but their eyes were watching him. Ethan, the voice came from behind. He turned. A man stood before him, tattered coat whipping in the unnatural wind, seaweed tangled in his long matted hair. His eyes were sunk in pits of blackness, but his voice was human. You are not supposed to be here. Ethan's throat tightened. Who are you? The man stepped closer. Elijah Harlow, captain of the Iron Widow. And you, his head tilted, his expression unreadable. You have been here before? Ethan's stomach dropped. That's not true. Harlow only smiled. Isn't it? Ethan felt the ship beneath him tilt. The world shifted. The whispers became a scream. Then, a hand grabbed his arm. Ethan! Reality snapped back. He was in the harbor master's office. Alice was shaking him, her eyes wide with terror. Luis and Rebecca were pulling the desk toward the door, their hands moving frantically. Cole was in the corner, staring at the mirror, his face ashen. Ethan gasped, his lungs burning. What just happened? Alice didn't answer. She just pulled him up. We have to go. He turned to the door. The figures were still there, but something had changed. They weren't moving. They stood motionless, as if waiting. Then one of them spoke. The tide is rising. The wind outside howled, and suddenly, the water came. Not from the ocean, not from anywhere real. It poured from the broken streets, from the alleyways, from the darkness itself. It surged through the town, black and thick like oil, swallowing everything in its path. Ethan grabbed Luis. We have to get to higher ground. Luis barely managed a nod, his face pale. Where? Rebecca pointed. The lighthouse. It was still standing, barely, a skeletal tower at the edge of the ruined port, its rusted railing and shattered glass reflecting the coming storm. It was their only chance. Go! Ethan shouted. They ran. The figures watched. And behind them, the sea itself came alive. The ground shook beneath them as the water surged forward, swallowing the cobblestone streets. The black tide was not just water, it was something alive, something writhing, twisting, pulling at the edges of reality. Ethan felt the unnatural cold against his skin, as if something inside the liquid was reaching for him. "Run!" Alice screamed. They bolted toward the lighthouse, their feet pounding against the uneven pavement. The town was collapsing around them, buildings crumbling, roofs caving in, windows shattering without anything touching them. The air itself felt thicker, heavier, filled with a pressure that pressed against their lungs. Ethan risked a glance back. The figures were still standing in the streets, watching, waiting. And then they started to walk into the water. One by one, they sank beneath the black tide, their bodies vanishing without a trace. No struggle, no fight. It was as if they were returning home. Ethan turned away, pushing forward. The lighthouse was close, only a few dozen feet away, but the water was rising fast. The old wooden docks had already been consumed, their remains floating like broken bones on the tide. Luis gasped. "We won't make it! We have to!" Ethan shouted. The lighthouse door was within reach. Then, Rebecca screamed. Ethan turned just in time to see something rise from the water. A hand. Not human. Not anymore. It was long, skeletal, the fingers too many, stretching out of the blackness. And then more hands followed, dozens of them, clawing, grasping, reaching for anything alive. Rebecca stumbled back, nearly losing her footing. Alice caught her, yanking her away as one of the hands slammed down where she had just been standing. The street split apart, the water gushing through the cracks. Cole cursed. "Move!" Ethan lunged forward, grabbing the lighthouse door. It was rusted shut. "No, no, no!" He threw his weight against it, kicking at the hinges. The others reached him, breathless, frantic. Behind them, the hands were crawling onto land. Not just hands anymore. Bodies. The figures that had once stood watching were climbing out of the water, but now they had changed. Their skin was no longer pale and salt-stained. It was rotting, dripping, their bodies breaking apart and reforming as they pulled themselves forward. Their eyes were gone, their mouths were open, and they were whispering. "Join us!" Ethan slammed against the door one last time. It gave way with a screech, sending him tumbling inside. The others followed, shoving the door shut behind them. Darkness swallowed them whole. For a moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing. Then, a single thump against the door. Slow, rhythmic, knocking. Rebecca whimpered. Louis scrambled for his flashlight, hands shaking as he flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the dust-filled air, revealing the decaying interior of the lighthouse. The spiral staircase loomed above them, rusted and warped with time. Alice exhaled sharply. "We have to go up." No one argued. They climbed, their footsteps echoing against the hollow walls. The air was thick with mildew, the scent of salt and rust coating their throats. The knocking on the door below didn't stop. Thump, thump, thump. And then it opened, a single creak of rusty hinges. Ethan froze mid-step, his blood turning to ice. Something had just entered the lighthouse. Louise swallowed. "Keep moving." They did, faster now. The wind howled through the shattered windows as they neared the top. The glass was gone, leaving the upper chamber exposed to the storm outside. But the worst part, the light, it was still on. A soft, pulsing glow filled the room, even though the machinery was long broken. And then something shifted in the corner. Ethan's breath caught. At first he thought it was just a shadow, but it moved. A figure sat hunched beside the rusted machinery. A man. His back was turned to them, his clothes soaked, tattered. His fingernails were black with rot. Rebecca whispered, Who is that?" The man twitched. Then he stood. His movements were unnatural, like a marionette with half-cut strings. Slowly he turned to face them, and Ethan knew him. His heart nearly stopped. It was Captain Elijah Harlow. But it wasn't just him. It was his reflection. Ethan staggered back as he realized Harlow's face was a twisted version of his own. The same jawline, The same eyes, the same haunted expression. You are not supposed to be here, Ethan. Ethan's mind reeled. How, how do you know my name? Harlow's lips curled into a smile. Because you were always meant to return. The wind screamed through the open windows. The whispers intensified, flooding Ethan's head. He clutched his skull, his vision warping, memories that weren't his slamming into his brain. The ship, the storm, the drowning, and a single, terrifying truth. He had been here before. The lighthouse trembled. The floor beneath them cracked. And then the light exploded, blinding, consuming. Reality ripped apart. Ethan screamed as the lighthouse shattered around him. The explosion of light wasn't just brightness. It was heat, sound, memory, all colliding in an unbearable force that sent him sprawling to the floor. Voices flooded his head, whispering, screaming, laughing. He saw flashes of the sea, waves rising unnaturally high, a ship splitting in two, bodies tossed into the abyss. And through it all, Harlow was watching, not the man, the thing wearing his face. Ethan gasped, clutching his skull as the voices clawed at his mind. He wasn't standing in the lighthouse anymore. He was somewhere else, a deck, wood rotting beneath his feet, the Iron Widow. The ship tilted violently, the storm overhead alive, churning with a darkness that wasn't just clouds. Ethan staggered, gripping the railing. His heart pounded. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. You remember now, don't you? The voice came from behind. Ethan turned. Harlow stood there, his presence more solid, more real than before. His soaked coat whipped in the unnatural wind, his blackened eyes piercing into Ethan's soul. What is this? Ethan shouted over the roaring storm. Harlow smiled. A grave. A wave crashed over the deck, but Ethan didn't feel the water. Instead, he felt cold hands gripping his arms, his legs, his neck, pulling him down. Figures rose from the sea, their skeletal hands clawing at him. The crew. They were dead, and they were taking him with them. Ethan fought, kicking, thrashing. The hands didn't loosen. The ship groaned, as if laughing, as if welcoming him home. Then a voice, familiar, distant. Ethan! His mind snapped back. The ship vanished. He was back in the lighthouse. Luis and Alice were shaking him, their faces filled with panic. Rebecca was screaming, her hands covering her ears. Cole stood near the edge of the broken railing, staring down at the sea, his eyes blank. The whispers were deafening. The lighthouse was crumbling. Ethan gasped, his chest heaving. We have to go. Alice grabbed his arm. Ethan, what the hell just happened? You disappeared. You were just standing there, staring at nothing. Ethan couldn't explain it. Not now. He looked toward Cole, and his stomach dropped. Cole wasn't blinking. He wasn't moving. His lips were moving, though, muttering, whispering, the same words as the figures below. Ethan rushed toward him. Cole! Hey, look at me! Cole's vacant eyes slowly turned to meet his, and then, in a voice that wasn't his own, he whispered, The sea is calling. Then he stepped backward, over the railing. Alice screamed. Ethan lunged, his hands just grazing Cole's arm as his friend vanished into the abyss. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the howling wind. Then, a sickening splash. Rebecca collapsed to her knees, her sobs lost in the wind. Luis stood frozen, his mouth moving but no words coming out. Alice covered her face. No. Ethan gripped the railing, his knuckles white. He forced himself to look down. The water below was calm. Cole was gone. There were no ripples, no movement, just blackness. And then, the whispers grew louder. The air around them thickened, pressing against their skulls. The lighthouse swayed, the structure groaning, collapsing in on itself. We have to move! Ethan grabbed Alice and Luis, yanking them toward the stairs. Rebecca didn't move. She was still on her knees, still staring at where Cole had fallen. Rebecca! Ethan shook her, his hands tight around her arms. We have to go. Now! Her lips trembled. He's still there. Ethan's blood ran cold. What? She pointed, but not at the water, at the mirror hanging near the rusted machinery. Ethan turned, and his breath caught. Cole was there. His reflection stood in the mirror, staring back at them, his face twisted in horror. His mouth moved, but the sound was muffled, as if coming from deep underwater. And behind him, the figures. They surrounded him, their hands on his shoulders, his arms, his throat. And then, one by one, they turned toward Ethan, and they smiled. A voice, Harlow's voice, whispered in Ethan's mind. One by one you will return. The mirror shattered, the lighthouse collapsed, and the sea rose to claim them all. The lighthouse crumbled around them, the floor tilting at an impossible angle. Ethan grabbed Alice and Luis, shoving them forward as the ceiling split apart, beams and shards of rusted metal raining down. The wind howled, drowning out Rebecca's screams. Then the entire structure gave way. The world flipped. For one terrifying moment, Ethan felt himself falling, air rushing past, debris tumbling alongside him. Then, impact. The sea swallowed them whole, cold, unforgiving, endless. Ethan hit the water with bone-crushing force. The breath knocked from his lungs. Darkness enveloped him. The weight of the sea dragged him down, deeper, deeper. And the whispers. They were everywhere now. Something moved in the water. Ethan struggled, his limbs burning, lungs screaming for air. A shape drifted past him, a face, pale and distorted by the depths. Cole. But his eyes were open, and he was smiling. Ethan choked, kicking upward, his hands clawing for the surface. More figures moved in the water, their arms reaching, their mouths whispering. One of them grabbed his ankle, a hand made of bone and seaweed, fingers tightening like a vice. Ethan kicked hard, breaking free just as the surface ripped open above him. He burst into the stormy air, gasping, choking, his vision swimming. "Ethan!" Alice's voice, close. He twisted, spotted her, clinging to a piece of wreckage, her face pale with terror. Luis was beside her, coughing violently. "Rebecca!" Ethan's stomach dropped. She was still in the water, drifting, unmoving. "No!" Ethan swam toward her, fighting the relentless pull of the waves. Rebecca's head bobbed beneath the surface, her lips moving, whispering. Ethan reached her, grabbing her wrist. "Rebecca! Hold on!" Her eyes opened, and for the first time Ethan saw it, saw what she had seen, the truth. The Iron Widow wasn't just a shipwreck, it was a doorway, a wound in reality, one that never truly healed, and they had opened it. The figures weren't ghosts. They were the crew, not dead, not alive, trapped in the endless pull of the tide. And now, so was Rebecca. Her skin paled, her pupils dilating. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. Then, her body jerked. A force yanked her downward. Ethan screamed, gripping her tighter. "No! You're not taking her!" But the sea was stronger. Rebecca's fingertips slipped through his grasp. And then, she was gone. Ethan gasped, staring into the churning abyss. The whispering faded as the sea swallowed her whole. Alice was crying. Louis sat in stunned silence. The lighthouse was gone, its ruins scattered in the waves. The town vanished, as if it had never been there. Only the wreck of the Iron Widow remained, half submerged, its broken mast still reaching toward the sky. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the storm ceased. The sea became eerily still. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He looked down at his hand. His palm burned where he had touched Rebecca. Something was still there, a part of the curse, and he knew. This wasn't over. It would never be over. Not until the sea claimed them all. Do you think Ethan will ever escape the curse of the Iron Widow? Or is he doomed to return to the sea? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more horror adventures. You never know what other lost places we might uncover next.